There is a queer witchery about the moon when it's full, Skulk Lawrence remarked, especially the moon that hangs over the valley of the Dwarsberg in the summertime. It does strange things to your mind, the Marico moon, and in your heart a wild and fragrant fancy, and your thoughts go very far away. If you have been sitting on your front stoop thinking these thoughts, you sigh and murmur something about the way of the world, and carry your chair inside. I've seen the moon in other places besides the Marico, but it's not the same there. Bram Venter, the man who fell off the government lorry once, near niet verdiend, says that the Marico moon is like a woman lying green flowers on a grave. Bram Venter often says things like that, particularly since the time he fell off the lorry. He fell on his head, they say. Always when the moon shines full like that, it does something to our hearts that we never understand. Always it awakens memories, and it is singular how different these memories are with each one of us. Johannes Oberholzer says the full moon always reminds him of one occasion when he was smuggling cattle over the Bechuanaland border. He never sees a full moon without thinking of the way it shone on the steel wire cutlass in his hand when the two mounted policemen rode up to him. The next night, Johannes Oberholzer had a good view of the full moon again through the window of the place where he was kept. He says the moon was large and yellow, except for the black stripes in front of it. And it was in the light of the full moon hanging over the thorn trees that I saw Drieka Breitenbach. Drieka was tall and slender. She had fair hair and blue eyes, and many considered her as the prettiest woman in Marico. I thought so too, that night when I met her under the full moon by the thorn trees. Her husband, Petrus Breitenbach, had married her in the Schweizer Rheinecker district during the big drought. Later, when Petrus was shot dead by one of his workers, Drieka left the Marico as quietly as she had come. The Marico felt different after Drieka left. I remembered Bram Venter's words about the moon being like a woman lying flowers on a grave, and for once they didn't seem like nonsense. But that came later. That night I saw Drieka leaning against the thorn tree by the road leading the drift. At first I didn't recognize her. All I saw was a figure dressed in white, with long hair loose over its shoulders. It seemed strange seeing a figure like that at such a time of night. I remembered stories about the ghosts and decided to turn back at once. There had also been a boulder lying in the road a few miles back. I thought it might be dangerous for passing cars. I decided quickly about the boulder, so quickly that the saddle girth broke from the way I jerked my horse back. Then the figure came forward and spoke. It was Drieka Breitenbach. Good evening, in answer to her greeting. I was just going back because I remembered something. About ghosts? She asked. No, I replied. About a stone in the road. Drieka laughed at that, and I laughed too. We stood there, laughing together under the moonlight, until I got off my horse and joined her under the thorn tree. If someone had told me that the predikant's mule cart had capsized because of the boulder, I would have laughed even more. That's the kind of thing the Marico moon does to you. I didn't ask her why she was there, why her hair was loose, or who she was waiting for. The moon was big and yellow, and the wind blew through the trees and across Drieka's white dress. It was enough. Before I knew it, we were seated on the grass under the thorn tree. We didn't talk at first. We just sat there, side by side, with our feet in the soft sand. Drieka smiled at me, and I saw how lovely she was. I felt I should say something. A woman, even a moon woman like Drieka, expects a man to be an entertaining companion. So I told her how a few days earlier a pebble had worked itself into my veldschoen and rubbed the skin of my toe. I took off my veldschoen and showed her the place. I also talked about rinderpest and how 2 of my cows had died of milk sick. Then I talked about the blue tongue in sheep, galansiekte, and the haarworm. But, of course, it was the moonlight that did it. I'd never known I was so good at idle conversation. The whole thing felt innocent enough. If Petrus Breitenbach had come along just then, he couldn't have said much about it. After a while, I stopped talking. Drieka took my hand. "Oh, Skull," she whispered, her blue eyes misty in the moonlight. "Do tell me some more." I'm sorry, Drieka. I don't know more. "But you must," she said softly. "Talk to me about other things." I thought for a moment. Yes, Drieka. There's one more thing I haven't told you about blue-tonguing sheep. No. Not that. Talk to me about the moon. So I told her what Bram Venter had said about the moon. The green flower story and the other one. She laughed and said, "That's much better than anything Bram Venter could say." Drieka leaned her head on my shoulder, and I thought for a moment that I loved her. Not for her beauty, but for her feet next to mine in the sand. Yet all the while, I felt it was the moon doing these things to me. You've got good feet for walking on. Bram Venter would have said, "I have good feet for dancing on." Drieka laughed and I began to feel jealous of Bram Venter. Then, suddenly, Drieka threw herself into my arms. Do you think I'm beautiful, Skulk?" "You are very beautiful." Will you do something for me if you love me?" she asked, her red lips close to my cheek. She drew my head down and whispered hot words in my ear. I thrust her from me and leaped to my feet. I found my horse and rode away, leaving Drieka under the thorn tree. Before I reached home, the moon had set behind the Dwarsberge. In the days that followed, I thought often of Drieka. Her loose hair, her lips, her feet in the roadside sand, but I was afraid of her. It seemed strange that the words we had shared under the moon had brought us close. Yet her whispering had driven me away. Later, when I heard that Drieka had gone back to the Schweizer district and her husband had been shot dead with his own Mauser, I was not surprised. I had expected it. Only it didn't seem right that Drieka should have found someone else to do what I refused. You mentioned the juba plant. Oh yes, everybody in the Marico knows about the juba plant. It grows high up on the kranzes, and they said you must pick off one of its little red berries at midnight, under the full moon. Then, if you are a young man and you are anxious for a girl to fall in love with you, all you have to do is squeeze the juice of the juba berry into her coffee. They say that after the girl has drunk the juba juice, she begins to forget all sorts of things. She forgets that your forehead is rather low, and that your ears stick out, and that your mouth is too big. She even forgets having told you the week before last that she wouldn't marry you if you were the only man in the Transvaal. All she knows then is that the man she gazes at over her empty coffee cup has grown remarkably handsome. You can see from this that the plant must be very potent in its effect. I mean, if you consider what some of the men in the Marico looks like. One night, I was out of shooting in the veld with a lamp fastened on my hat. You know, that kind of shooting. In the glare of the lamplight, you can only see the eyes of the thing you are aiming at. And you get 3 months if you are caught. They made it illegal to hunt by lamplight since the time a police got shot in the foot this way, when he was out tracking cattle smugglers on the Bechuanaland border. The magistrate, a jurist, who did not know the ways of the cattle smugglers, found that the shooting was an accident. This verdict satisfied everybody except the police, whose foot was still bandaged when he came into court. But the men in the Volksraad, some of whom had been cattle smugglers themselves, knew better than the magistrate did as to how the policeman came to have a couple of buckshot in the soft part of his foot, and accordingly they brought in this new law. Therefore, I walked very quietly the night of the krans. Frequently, I put out my hand and stood very still amongst the trees and waited long moments to make sure I was not being followed. Ordinarily, there would have been little to fear, but a couple of days before, 2 policemen had been seen disappearing into the bush. By their looks, they seemed young policemen, anxious for promotion, who didn't know that it's more becoming for a policeman to drink an honest farmer's peach brandy than to arrest him for hunting by lamplight. I was walking along, turning the light from side to side, when suddenly, about 100 paces from me, in the full brightness of the lamp, I saw a pair of eyes. When I also saw above the eyes a policeman's khaki helmet, I remembered that a moonlight night such as that was not so good for finding buck. So I went home. I took the shortest way to which was over the side of the krans, the steep side. And on my way down, I clutched at a variety of branches, tree roots, stone ledges, and tufts of grass. Later on, at the foot of the krans, when I came to and was able to sit up, there was the policeman bending over me. Skulk, he said. I was wondering if you would lend me your lamp. I looked up. It was Gideon van der Merwe, a young policeman who had been stationed for some time at Derdepoort. I'd met him on several occasions and had found him very likable. You can have my lamp, I answered, but you must be very careful. It's worse for a policeman to get caught breaking the law than for an ordinary man. Gideon van der Merwe shook his head. No, man, I don't want to go shooting with a lamp. I want to... It seems silly to say it, but perhaps you'll understand. I've come to look for a juba plant. I need it for my studies, for my 3rd class sergeant's exam. And it'll soon be midnight, Skulk, and I can't find one without these. But I can't find one of those plants anywhere. I felt sorry for Gideon. It struck me that he would never make a good policeman. If he couldn't find a juba plant, of which there were thousands on the krans, it would be much harder for him to find the spoor of a cattle smuggler. So I handed him my lamp and explained where he had to go and look. Gideon thanked me and walked off. Half an hour later, he was back. He took a red berry out of his tunic pocket and showed it to me, for fear that he should tell any more lies about needing the juba berry for his studies. I spoke first. Letty Cordier. Gideon nodded. He was very shy though, and wouldn't talk much at the start. But I guessed long ago that Gideon van der Merwe was not calling at Christian Cordier's house so often just to hear Christians relate to the stories of his life. Next morning, I rode over to Christian Cordier's farm that he still owed me from the last dipping season. When Letty came in with coffee, I made a casual remark to her father about Gideon van der Merwe. I didn't take much notice of Christian's remark, however. Instead, I looked carefully at Letty when I mentioned Gideon's name. She didn't give much away, but I'm quick at these things, and I saw enough. The color that crept into her cheeks the light that came in her eye. On my way back, I encountered Letty. She was standing under a thorn tree with her brown arms and a sweet, quiet face and her full bosom. She was a very pretty picture. There was no doubt that Letty Cordier would make a fine wife for any man. It wasn't hard to understand Gideon's feelings about her. Letty, do you love him? I love him, Oomskal, she answered. I love him. It was as simple as that. When I saw Gideon sometime afterwards, he was elated, as I had expected he would be. So, the Juba plant worked? I inquired. It was wonderful, Oomskalk. And the funny part of it is that Letty's father wasn't there either. When I put the Juba juice into her coffee, Letty had brought her father a message just before then that he was wanted in the Millie lands. And was the Juba juice all it claimed for? You'd be surprised how quickly it acted. Letty just took one sip at the coffee and then jumped right onto my lap. But then Gideon van der Merwe winked in a way that made me believe that he was not so very simple. After all, I was pretty certain that the Juba juice would work, Oomskalk. After Letty's father told me that you had visited him there earlier that morning. Terrible thing that happened to Christian Lemmer, Oomskalk Lawrence said. It was bad for me, of course, but much worse for Christian. I remember it well because it happened when the first gramophone came to Marico Bushveld. Christian bought the machine from a Jew trader from Pretoria. It was funny when you think about it. Whenever there's something we Boers don't need, the Jews traders will bring it to us, and sure enough, we will buy it too. If the Jews traders brought us Miltstick, we'd probably buy that too and pay them after all our cattle were dead. So, when a trader brought Christian a second-hand gramophone, he sold some sheep and bought it. People came from miles to hear it talk. Christian was as proud of it as a child with a new toy, turning the handle and putting it in the sharp pins. The people who came to listen said it was amazing what inventions a man could come up with once the devil got hold of him. They said that if nothing else, the devil had good brains. Most of the songs the gramophone played were in English, but there was one Afrikaans song, "O Brandewyn laat my staan." It played it well enough, but it sounded as though a German was trying to make an Afrikaans sound English.
Brandewyn laat my staan. O brandewyn laat my staan. O brandewyn laat my staan.
Was just like the Rooinek. First, they took our country and governed it better than we could, and now they wanted to fix our language too. But if people talk about Christian's gramophone, they spoke even more about how unhappily him and his wife, Susanna, lived together. Christian was about 35, a big, strong man. His shoulders were broad, and you could see his muscles through his shirt when he moved. Despite his size, he was good-natured and rarely got annoyed. Even when the drought came, and his pump broke so he couldn't get water for his cattle, he just walked aside, lit his pipe, and said it was the Lord's will. But Christian had a temper if pushed. I remember the time the Mtosa chief passed him in the veld and said, "Good morning," without taking off his leopard skin or calling Christian boss. Christian was fined £10 by the magistrate and had to pay for the doctor too during the 3 months the chief walked with his stick. The unfortunate part was that Christian and Susanna couldn't get along. Susanna was much younger than him, but she often didn't look it. She was small and fair, with hair the color of a mealie beer just after ripening. She always wore a wide kappie to shield her face from the sun. She was quiet and rarely spoken, unless it was to mention something everyone knew, like how the Indian shopkeeper in Ramutsa mixed roasted krimetart roots with a coffee. Still, despite her quiet ways, she and Christian were always quarreled. Everyone knew it, though Susanna never showed much emotion in public. One day, I went to Christian's farm to borrow some baling wire for the theft. Christian had gone hunting for ribbok, and Susanna was home alone. I could see she had been crying, so I sat beside her on the rimpies bunk and took her hand. Don't cry, Susanna. Everything will be all right. You just need to understand Christian a bit better. He's not a bad fellow. At first she was angry with me and told me to leave, but soon she softened. And I comforted her. I might have comforted her even more, but I wasn't sure how long Christian would be gone, and I was a bit scared of his temper. To change the mood, I asked Susanna to play the gramophone. I didn't really want to hear it, but you always pretend to be interested in your friends' things, especially when you're borrowing from them. She set it up and played a song, laughing as she listened. At that moment, she looked quite pretty. But when the music ended, she looked as though she might cry again. Soon after, Christian came back, and I left. Before I did, Susanna brought in coffee. It was weak, but I didn't say anything. Like an Englishman, I drank it and said nothing, even though it wasn't fit for a farm worker. But Christian spoke. Vrouw, the coffee is weak. Yes, Susanna answered. It's very weak. Yes, she replied. Why do you always... Christian began, but Susanna interrupted. Oh, go to hell. Then they went at it, swearing at each other, not even hearing me say, goodbye, and may the good Lord bless you all. It was a dark night 3 months later when I went back to Christian's house to borrow his wagon sail. I was leaving early the next morning for Zeerust with a load of mealies. Before I was halfway to his house, it started raining, big drops hitting my face. There was something eerie about the sound of the wind in the trees. When I passed the graveyard where the Lemmer family was buried, I thought of strange things like death and ghosts. But by the time I reached the house, the rain had stopped. There were no lights, and I knocked for a long time before Christian opened the door, holding a lantern. He looked agitated at first, but then smiled when he saw me. Come in, you skulk. I'm glad you're here. I was starting to feel lonely with the rain and the wind. But you're not alone. What about Susanna? Oh, Susanna went back to her mother yesterday, Christian replied. We sat in the voorkamer talking and smoking. The wind blew through the gaps of the thatched roof and the candle flickered. Christian seemed restless. He lit his pipe but had to strike several matches before it caught. I tried to make light of it. What's the matter, Christian? You look so unhappy. Someone might think your wife is still here. Christian laughed, but it was too loud. His laughter combined with the wind howling outside gave me an odd feeling. Let's play the gramophone, I suggested. I knew how to work it by then, so I put in a pin and started it. The song was O Brandewyn Laat My Staan, the same one Susanna had played 3 months earlier. I thought of her as the song played and glanced at Christian. He quickly looked away when our eyes met. The wind outside grew louder and the house seemed colder. I was relieved when the song finally ended. There was something about Christian's behavior that made me a bit uneasy. Besides, Christian seemed very queer about Susanna. Then an awful thought occurred to me. You know, sometimes you get a thought like that and you know that it is true. I got up instantly and took my hat. I saw that all round the place where the gramophone stood, the dung floor of the voorkamer had been loosened and then stamped down again. The candle threw flickering shadows over the floor and over the clods of loose earth that had not been stamped down properly. I drove back without the baksail.
O Brandewyn laat my staan. O Brandewyn laat my staan. O Brandewyn laat my staan. Want ek wil nou huis toe.